Hello and welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast. I'm your host, Flora and Ulrich, and I'm joined today by my co-host and director of Ideal Spaces, Ulrich Gehmann.
I'm glad to be here and we will have an interesting conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And today we'll be joined by Ian Boyd, who has worked in the environmental sector for nearly 40 years as a practitioner, project manager, programme director and consultant in public, private and voluntary organisations. Ian was born and raised in Birmingham, where he developed a real passion for wildlife and city spaces. He spent a decade living and working on nature reserves around the UK, learning how habitats work, before settling on the Isle of Wight and working to see it become a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve in 2019. Ian has worked in the charity, public and private sectors, running landscape restoration, urban regeneration and environmental education programmes, and advising on sustainable practice in development, asset management and urban design. He is a director of the consultancy ARC Biodiversity and Climate, which includes the research partnership and ecological engineering practice Art Ecology. He is also a director of the public realm non-profit The Common Space. It's a truly impressive CV and lots of points of interest and also comparison with our work at Ideal Spaces. So without further ado, Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Flora. Thank you very much, Ulrich. It's wonderful to be here.
I was thinking about how to start our set of questions, and I thought we could start by talking about your love of wildlife and urban spaces, which is, of course, this common thread that runs through the breadth of very inspiring projects you've been involved in over the years. And something that struck me when I was preparing the introduction for this episode was not just your passion for wildlife and spaces, but also your interest in helping to build a better and more meaningful connection between people and their local environment in many different contexts and ways. Would you say that's a fair reflection of your portfolio of work?
Yes, I think so, Flora. And of course, that's quite a broad sort of category of work to be active within, really. So it gives me lots of opportunities to do interesting things. And being someone who lacks meaningful self-discipline and is attracted by shiny things, it's great because it means I can go and pursue these different ideas. Now, I've always done that. And I'm very grateful for the opportunities to have been able to do that. And I continue to do that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fundamental connection between people and wildlife is well known. It doesn't really need to be articulated because it is simply normal to be delighted by wildlife. To have an experience of the natural world in your daily life is a good and healthy thing. And we don't need to kind of fetishize that or make it something remarkable or exceptional. It just is. And growing up in nearly in the middle of Birmingham, so England's second city, wildlife was all around me. Nevertheless, this is back in the 70s, so it's a while ago. Things haven't changed that much. I don't think so, really. So my experience of wildlife was every day, even in the middle of a city, going out on holidays, being dragged up mountains by my father, endless rain in Wales. It's my memory of our summer holidays, but they all involve wildlife, including fossils. So the idea of kind of ancient wildlife. But coming back to Birmingham and living there wasn't a void. There was wildlife everywhere. And it was wonderful that I could encounter that and see it at school, at home, the places I kind of explored around where I lived. And that stayed with me forever. And I just believe that is always and constantly essential.
Yeah, this raises one question. As regards the combination of what could be called natural capital with the social and the cultural capital. Could you line out the major relationship between these three forces, if we conceive them as forces of their own?
Yes, it's interesting because I think they have become siloed in an unhelpful way, really. And of course, it's important to be able to unpick big, baggy concepts in a way that allows you to explore them and to find ways of articulating them better. But fundamentally, I think this idea of, let's call it foundation capital, this essential block of resource that we all share. And it's expressed in different ways in different places. That's why places become important for foundation capital, because they contain content that is unique to them, regardless of how uninspiring they may seem at first. They all contain this mix. But I suppose in terms of work, the idea of social capital being the frame, the habitat for humans, let's call it that, the networks, the framework, the architecture of spaces and channels of movement between those spaces, the natural capital being the ecosystem that hosts that space. We are all hosted within functioning ecosystems. We may do our best to destroy them or to degrade them anyway, but nonetheless, they exist and we're part of that. And the cultural capital being the human personality in a place, and that is different everywhere. And these three things come together, but they are bound, I think, by natural capital, by the fact that it is hosted within, as I say, a functioning ecosystem, within a habitat that we have altered, perhaps even created, but nonetheless, it is ingrained. We are part of the natural world. We may pretend we're not, but we are. And so the three come together, I think, in this foundation concept everywhere, no matter where it is, everywhere. And it's our job to explore that and to maximize the value for us and for the natural world in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important, as you say, and something that I think people can often take for granted, the natural world and their relationship with it. And you mentioned there space and also place. And I wondered if you see the difference between the two. I mean, my opinion is that, and this is probably something that Ulrich would share, there are lots of spaces out there that are designed without a particular audience in mind. And because of that, they don't really address issues or challenges that particular community that lives there faces. Would you agree that what people need are actually places, specific places that are specifically designed and tailored to them and their needs?
Yes, absolutely. I would, Flora. I think, and I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. Places are inevitably made up of and composed of spaces. That's kind of necessary. It's impossible not to see it that way. But their identity and their distinctiveness as place is dependent on this mix of foundation capitals we've talked about, and is compromised, always compromised by undesigned throwaway spaces. And I totally agree with you. So most of the spaces that we inhabit are not optimized for us or for wildlife. What they are leftover bits from development or seen as purely a maintenance chore. So actually, their utility, their value is bypassed entirely. They go from being built to being sold, or they go from being created to being maintained, and nothing in between. And that simply compromises the value of place. Place is the expression of human and natural personality in a place, and it has a time depth and it has a future trajectory. And spaces that are designed with that content in mind and with an aspiration to pursue a future that is based on that, of course, are amazing. And we look on them with wonder when we see them, as if they are somehow magical, and yet they should be just normal. We've gotten too used to simply putting up with terrible, throwaway, sterile, boring, dull, and even toxic spaces that compromise our ability to actually articulate place. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Given this as general background, I absolutely agree with you. And the majority of recent urban environment is just simply some space without individuality, without being distinctive, and not really designed for human beings to live in and to prosper there. Seen from this background, your foundation pillars you mentioned, also the social and natural and cultural capital in unification, in combination, to be put and realized as a place. How to realize these places under the recent adverse conditions?
Yes, so difficult. Well, actually, is it difficult? And I wonder whether I'm not just immediately falling into that trap of saying, oh, well, it's terribly difficult, because we kind of make that assumption that somehow that is going to be problematic. And I think that's a symptom of seeing successful places and spaces as being exceptional. We have a huge problem, and I think it is a massive problem, of rewarding what should be normal as award-winning exceptions. There are just too many awards actually out there in the world. We keep doing this, and somehow that just makes the possibility of making just great everyday functional spaces harder and harder, because they seem to be the preserve of the award-winning architect, the domain of the extraordinary and unusual development project. And they're not, they shouldn't be. I think it's a matter of will, of actual will, and I think it's a matter of democracy. I think the democratic voice in places is absent. So street level democratic voice, this idea of a kind of civic identity, or even a set of rules that govern the way a place functions and evolves, have been stripped out in favour of bland development and a planning system, certainly here in the UK, that is just too pressured to be able to cope with dealing with what it sees as just too much detail, too much fuss around getting the place just right. Is it too awful to accept through planning? And if it's just not that bad, it will get through. And that's where we are. I think we have gotten used to places that, well, it's not that bad. And we kind of just shrug our shoulders and say, well, it could be worse. Well, yeah, it could be worse, but it could be a lot better too. And so I think there's a mindset thing here. Policy instruments matter. Of course they do. They absolutely do. But so does civic voice. The voice of a locality, and that might be a parish, or it might be a town, or it might be a neighborhood, it might be a school, like some kind of bit of civic geography saying, actually, this is what we want. This is the sort of space that we demand, in fact, from our leaders, from our community leaders, from our council, from the development industry that surrounds us, that it needs to be maintained in this way. It has to be built in this way because it's cost efficient. What about the economy? Well, the economy is entirely a cultural artifact. Why do we keep pretending it's not? So I long-winded answer, sorry, Ulrich, but I think it is something around mindset. We have become too attuned to accepting throwaway, redundant places, and that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. The question would be how to install this new democratic impact in the existing system.
Absolutely. And so here we've gotten very involved in the English town and parish councils. So they are a great example of how this change can happen and must happen. So here where I am on the Isle of Wight, we have 33 town and parish councils. So they define the civic geography of the whole of the Isle of Wight. And this is not unusual. About 60% of England is covered in parish councils. But let's call them local councils. Now, they are democratically elected, but the democratic system around them is hopeless because we tend to just ignore them as if they're irrelevant. They're all volunteers, as all councillors are, but they have tremendous power. They have money to spend, they have access to additional money to spend, and they have power to, and they have discretion without oversight to intervene in their locality. So starting at that level and saying, right, what can we do to improve this area? What are the priorities for young people, for old people, for nature conservation, for amenity, for health, for tackling inequality? Well, we can do that at the level of about 3, 5, 8, even 8,000 people based around this idea of a locality, of a district, with some kind of democratic institution that has the power to intervene, mainly in public places. Now, if we can start to retrofit solutions, bring them to public attention, engage with the community around what we're doing, tree planting here, nest boxes there, all fairly standard stuff, free public events over here, small but persistent changes to the public realm over here with this partner, this partner, this partner. From that, we can extract a set of principles that when the next development comes in, we say, well, hang on, you need to do these 5 things that we've demonstrated here. They all need to be present in your development, or we will simply not accept it. So I think there's a job for retrofit projects at community level that show how problems that have persisted can be not altogether fixed, but tackled, begin to be tackled, that from which you draw the rules of place, a set of principles of place that you then articulate through public discourse. Now, that's easy to say and hard to do, but I think there's something in that, starting with projects that are partnership projects and pushing them up into ambition for the next big public project, the next bit of levelling up, big thing here in the UK at the moment, levelling up. So I think projects have a role, and they pull together partners who can then articulate those ideas at the next opportunity and the next opportunity. That's one way anyway.
And that's probably also presumably the beauty of you having that non-profit element to your work that works so nicely in parallel, and not just in parallel, but together with the consultancy piece that we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Could you give us some examples of where a project on the ground or a piece of research or community workshopping or something like that has led to something on a bigger scale?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of examples here on the island. I think, Flora, I guess a big one really was the pursuit of UNESCO World Biosphere status.
Yes, of course.
So the island is one of 7 in the UK, 3 in England. It must be nearly 800 in the world by now. There's a few more each year. But it's an extraordinary achievement. We need to be very grateful for our local team that delivered that. Lots of us helped, but it was led by what's called the AONB team, the Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty team here on the Isle of Wight. That's a nationally important landscape designation that has a team embedded in the local authority, but kind of semi-detached. Around the edges of that piece of work, we have all worked very hard to try and articulate what that means. Well, what does biosphere mean? And how can we take the big idea of biosphere, cultural diversity, biological diversity, long-term benefit for people and the natural world in the same place at the same time? How can we take that big idea and crunch it right down into small, practical, affordable projects so that every one of them carries the biosphere message? And we've tried to do that here. I mean, just where I'm talking to you from in our office, almost on the beach, Sandown on the Isle of Wight, just out the window, are a whole set of small projects that we have been able to develop, as you say, through the common space, which carry the biosphere message and therefore reinforce the big stuff at the other end, which is policy change. And that is beginning to happen. And it allows folks to say, oh, no, I do see what you mean now. It's not just a line of policy. I can see what you mean. You mean environmental improvements that I've got free access to, that I can come to any time I want to, that offer me a bit of refuge space when I feel stressed, that offer me an encounter with wildlife that I might not otherwise have thought about, that give me a range of other things I can do with my family, with my friends. And that there's a sense of pride in having that on my doorstep, in my place. So we've tried to do that on the one hand. On the other hand, we've been quite involved in what's called place planning. Now, I know there's whole industry around place shaping, place planning, and that's good and it's bad. It just depends on what comes out the other end. But we got quite involved with our consulting hats on in developing place plans on the Isle of Wight. And we've written 3. In Ryde, in Newport, and in Cowes. So different urban parts of the island. The island's about 80% rural. So these urban centres really kind of stand out. But then once we've done that piece of work, big public consultation, they act as voluntary agreements between civic stakeholders, essentially. So it's not statutory, and that gives it flexibility. So they're designed to adapt and change and evolve. Pulling that together to create a set of priorities in that place, distinctive to that place, that can be delivered simply through better partnership arrangements between existing organisations with their existing budgets. We haven't got to sit back and wait for huge amounts of money to arrive before you can do anything. It tends to sterilise civic work, doing things that way. Once we did that work, swap hats to the common space, we step in as volunteers and we try and keep that involvement in it. And I would say that Ryde in particular on the Isle of Wight, so that's 26,000 people. So a big chunk of the island's 140,000 people in a coastal town on the north of the island, on the Solent coast of the island, has gone through an unbelievable transformation since 2017. Place Plan was a part of that, but as a voluntary organisation, we've been able to see this unfold. And it is just extraordinary. And it is exactly what we've been talking about, a mix of social, cultural and natural interventions, reinvesting in those foundation capitals. Let's talk about it that way. Buying back public buildings, supporting the arts and cultural industries on the island, looking for opportunities to turn environmental practice into opportunity for enterprise. It's the whole social enterprise agenda. So looking to invest in what's special about Ride and turn it into practical tools for a better future. And as a voluntary organisation, we can kind of mix in there and try this and try that with that. So it works very well for us, Flora, to be able to just swap hats in that way. And also we learn a great deal because we get a chance to test out the implementation of some of this strategic stuff. It's all very well writing great big plans, but if you never get to see what it's like on the ground, you never learn how to do it better next time.
It sounds like a very interesting approach, a realistic approach, how to really change things so towards the better. It's a good point in it. Because my concern was as an external observer when I looked at this new hype in the green city movement as a general movement. There was an overemphasis of technology, in my eyes at least. The same technological mindset that let modernity unfold now is still prevalent in this green city / ecological city approaches. We will ameliorate our circumstances of living, or even more direct, we will ameliorate and save the world via technology. In creating the most perfect ecologically adapted technology, there is no point of cultural heritage, for instance. A place for a community and distinctiveness includes a certain kind of cultural heritage. We have old buildings and so on. And it's a very big difference if one of these cultural heritage buildings is just conceived as an entity to be preserved, but we living here have no inner connection to this entity any longer. It is just standing there. We have a Gothic cathedral, for instance, that is there, but we have no connections as neither to its aesthetics nor to its mental and social function.
Yeah.
It's a reserved object. No? And on the other hand, our real concentration is on the technologically perfected ecological new environments. No? And this is a gap in my eyes between culture and ecology plus technique.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree, Ulrich. And I think it's part of the same appetite, I suppose, and also the same spin culture to some extent, that technological solutions will eventually solve everything, that there will be a technics solution. And we kind of see that in climate change, where carbon capture technology, which would have to work at planetary scale, we can't even get it to work at the smallest scale at the moment, that somehow these kind of ideas will inevitably roll out and save us all. And in the meantime, we just carry on doing what we want to do. And I think it's part of that same there's a sort of overweening ambition about it. There's an arrogance about it that I think in some ways just carries us all along with it. So certainly I agree. I think building technology and the sustainability agenda have drifted to one side and have focused entirely on renewables, on intelligent buildings, on BEAM, the acronym over here, such that waste is minimized and energy is efficient and water is efficient, and that those metrics are measured through, as we know, through whatever it might be. It might be whatever kind of regulatory instrument you're actually engaging, whatever award you're looking for, whether it's part of your ESG portfolio, that these metrics drive that kind of focus. But we still end up with a super sterile, bland, uninteresting building at the end of it that does nothing for the human psyche. Walking down the street, I'll pay no attention to this thing. You end up with London's comedy skyline, which is just a monument to sort of insane architectural nonsense.
Exactly. Yeah.
So just the idea of everyday visible contact with delight in the built form. These are the habitats we're building for ourselves, and we are doing them unbelievably badly all the time. And one solution to that is to think more about how do you make the built environment, built surfaces, colonizable, useful in a managed way for urban wildlife, so that you begin to bring wildlife very deliberately into those spaces, and you use the colonization of structures and buildings, old and new. Of course, old buildings already do this, but we keep scrubbing it all off because we're terrified that a lichen will make the wall collapse, which it won't. How do we bring wildlife in simple plants, small organisms, small invertebrates that are drifting through the urban realm all the time anyway. So this amazing idea of aerial plankton, the top 200 meters above the planetary surface, is full of stuff. It's constantly full of stuff. All we need to do is to provide platforms, surfaces, textured, designed surfaces that will allow this natural process to develop in front of our eyes. And if we do it cleverly, it will provide us with decoration, with ornament, with patina. It will enhance the visual appeal, the beauty of the urban environment through the natural process of colonization. So suddenly you've got this interface between the aesthetics of urban space and the ecological function of urban space. And that ecological function then pulls us into the same domain because we benefit from that contact with the natural world. So let's stop sterilizing buildings. Let's use the fact that heritage structures and our architectural heritage in urban spaces can demonstrate for us how beautifully textured, complex surfaces, a range of different materials can attract the natural world very readily in a way that these glass and plastic surfaces can't. And let's try and find a space in between. That brings the cultural world straight into the forefront of ecological design immediately. And therefore, there is a bridge to the past that we can explore. Green roofs and green walls, fine. I think they're great. But very often they are just pointlessly decorative. They have no ecological function at all. And they're incredibly expensive to maintain. They're run on hydroponics or whatever it might be. That's not getting us anywhere. You can have a wall covered in moss for nothing. Just stop bleaching it. That's all you need to do. And then we move on. We move on to the next bit and the next bit. And we link these surfaces to our parks. We change the landscaping in our public places so that the wildlife that's beginning to find its way into these buildings is coming down into public parks. And we're seeing the solitary bees from the green roof feeding in the public park. And then it's all beginning to connect. So it's connecting up these surfaces in a way that supports wildlife and becomes decorative. It's that simple.
It's really interesting, actually, because I think I've seen a lot of these. Well, I mean, I'm saying decorative in the sense that people just think they look pretty. These green, grassy walls popping up on the side of buildings. And you look at them and you think, yes, it might look attractive, but it's serving absolutely no purpose. And I think there's something here as well about not just kind of built heritage, but also the natural heritage that we can also reintroduce into our cities.
That connectivity is beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. And it's bringing together these very important factors in a really meaningful way, which I suppose leads me on to my next question, which is there something here about education that people just don't really get it? They kind of think they're doing the right thing. They're bringing a bit of green in. It looks nice. They don't really know how to do it. And how do we get people to properly and fully understand and do it in a meaningful way?
I think you've put your finger on it really, Flora, and I would describe this as cultural coding. We have been programmed to believe that a neat place is a good place, that a tidy place is a healthy place, that a clean, pristine, clean surface is a good building. That's a good project. And it's just not true. And so you're absolutely right. And you know this anyway from public feedback. So there's a great example, just again outside the window, lots of examples outside the window. Obviously, depends how far you go, but I mean, really just outside the window. We have a bit of seafront, we have a bit of seawall, and we ask permission to allow natural colonization to take place on this. It's a flagstone surface, so it's made of concrete slab. So of course there are gaps in between and little things find their way in and begin to grow. And then a man will come out and annihilate it all immediately because we mustn't let that happen. You know, who knows what might happen if we actually allow plants to grow in the urban realm. So we said, well, can we just stop that for a bit and see what happens? And they did. And when I say they, the local authority and the various folks involved in looking after these places, all of whom, you know, are keen to help where they can. That's a whole other question, is the where they can bit. And it was just extraordinary. The immediate response from local people from a particular age group, I would suggest, generally, that's just the way it is, were unbelievably horrified that there were things growing And yet they all have gardens. They all go for a walk in the park with their dog. But these things growing, which in another place they would say, oh, isn't that beautiful? That's a beautiful thing. Thrift, sea camping. Here somehow was genuinely a catastrophe that this was being allowed to happen. And it was so instructive into how we've been brainwashed into thinking this way. It's absolute nonsense. So now what we can't do is go on the attack and say, you're wrong. You're just wrong. Because, as I said, it's cultural coding. We have to find ways. One is being brave about it and not immediately responding by sending the team back out to cleanse it. That's political bravery. And this comes back to democratic rules in local places. If part of the feeling of a place is, no, we've got a pretty relaxed approach to the way that we look at urban space and wildlife, then you're already in the right place, because it doesn't sound as though, these voices are not the voices of our community. So it needs careful handling. But once we get over that hurdle, and it is a hurdle, I think, you're into fantastically new territory, which is exploring how we just take our hands off the maintenance machine. So we're saving money for a start. And it's about patience. It's not going to look like a wildflower meadow tomorrow, but in 3 years, it'll be amazing. It's a patient, persistent, bold, and brave project to allow this stuff to happen and to bring people along with it. Not everyone will be happy. That's just the way it is. So it is an exercise in dealing with cultural coding that has set us back into this maintenance headspace, maintenance rules. And that's crazy. It's just so destructive. But we can tackle that through projects, through local projects.
And I think there's something in there about people being happy to give up control. Because I think if you've got your own garden, you can decide what exactly you want to plant. How do you want it to look? Are you going to tidy up that bit? You're going to sweep up the leaves today? Yeah. It's all within your control. Whereas if it's a space that you've become used to, that's quite neat and tidy, suddenly, I suppose, if it changes and that's not within your control and it's, something completely different is happening, I can see how people would be, it would take a while to get used to. I'm also wondering about young people, what role you see for them and, the future generations and how we can change that cultural coding from a young age.
Yes, absolutely. Completely essential. One way is through engaging youth voice in the projects that we're doing. So we work with organisations like the Prince's Trust, that's 16 to 25-year-olds. We work with an organisation that set up a youth forum just on our doorstep through media projects. So doing a bit of filming, doing some Vox Pops work, listening to what they say about the places that they use and why they're important to them, and beginning to recognise and acknowledge and respect those ideas and building them into these new, refreshed, let's say, ideas around how we manage and maintain space, so that we are beginning to make them more usable, less hostile to young people. We do a terrible, terrible disservice to the future by creating environments that are so hostile to young people. It's absolutely unacceptable, completely unacceptable. But we can begin to plan for a better future by making sure that their freer minds, their lack of the same kind of entrenched cultural coding, is released into a better way of thinking about the future and place. So rather than chasing them all away on the Isle of Wight, we have got a catastrophe in the making, a demographic time bomb. In 10 years, there won't be any young people, really. Well, what are we going to do then? We might as well just turn the lights off at that point. So we have to find ways of making it feel as though this is a place that I want to stay or I want to come back to, because it's listened to me and I can see spaces and places where I can intervene. I can have my say. I can make my mark. I can develop my ideas. So all of this is possible, but we need to program it into meaningful project delivery work on the ground, however small. And we need to allow these things to persist as the new norm. We mustn't just stop when the project finishes, write a report, do a press release and say, well, wasn't that wonderful? And everyone goes, yeah, that was wonderful. And then we just go back to sleep. We can't do that. We have to begin this program of change, bringing young people into that more and more and more. It's amazing when I think back 10 years ago, because we moved into this office nearly 10 years ago, and we were doing projects with young people. Well, they're in their 20s now. So they are the future already now. So within just that 10 years, which goes away in a blink when you're in your 50s, like I am, that change has already happened, and we didn't think about it properly. We didn't program it in that way, that in that short space of time, these young people are becoming part of the civic community in a completely different way. So, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Flora, that we must listen, acknowledge, respect. What we mustn't do, sorry to labour the point, is we mustn't just use youth voice. There are too many projects that need to tick a box to get their funding by engaging with youth, and they bring them in and they listen to them and then they send them away again, and that's the end of it. That's not okay. So it needs to be real, needs to be genuine and authentic in the way that we think about this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Thank you. I suppose my other question is around the appearance of cities, because if we're not going for the totally green city idea, do you think there are themes that will emerge over time in terms of how places will start to look? I know we talked about how if we allow green to come in to the cities, there'll be some really interesting things in terms of patterns and reflecting identity and heritage. But do you think there'll be some bigger themes in terms of actually how people choose to build either from new or to retrofit historic buildings, if we're not also to go down the road of just looking for real technological forward-thinking solutions? Not sure, open question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a big question. So I think there are some interesting things happening. I think the agile approach to retrofit building, residential, commercial, educational, whatever it might be, so plugging holes in the urban environment with new building techniques is really fascinating. So modular units, easy to construct, perhaps meanwhile buildings that pop up here, but actually they don't quite fit there, so we'll move them somewhere else. I think that's a fascinating idea. And that conjunction between the old and the new, between the highly technological and, well, technological in its day, but less so now, in direct adjacency is really very exciting and very interesting. It's a necessity. We must do this. To go back to those historic buildings, just as Ulrich said earlier, a Gothic building, a town hall that is just seen as a dead weight, a money pit, something we cannot afford. So it sits, it gets worse, it gets worse, it gets worse. Suddenly we begin to bring in new architectural ideas, new living functions through modular building techniques and others, high density approaches to the use of urban space that plug in, I mean, actually literally perhaps plug into these buildings and bring new life. What we mustn't do is to continually go to the edges of our urban places and create empty rental sheds, thousands of them and thousands of them, and call it regeneration, because it is nothing of the sort. What we must do is to revisit these underutilized, not redundant, just forgotten spaces that have this amazing time depth, and therefore they have a future to give us as well. It doesn't stop, keeps going. And to think about curated spaces. So I think the heritage element requires us to think about curated urban spaces rather than disposable urban spaces. Build a thing and sell it is disposal. Organize a like-minded group of tenants in a historic building who are kind of in the same space, are quite happy that it's a bit shabby, it's not perfect. Rental value recognizes that. Maybe there are some folks who move in that corner before the rest of the building is even usable, and they begin their work in that space. Maybe there are tenants who actually pay no rent at all because they're beginning to fix the fabric of the building in return for being in it. Curated spaces that bring the modern and the old together in the same place. Now that requires an organizing mind. That requires a different approach, requires an enterprising local authority, for example, a local council that wants to really get its hands onto this stuff rather than just hands off, give it to the private sector. And I do see that happening, but I think that's the exciting thing about urban space. It isn't so heavily protected by environmental designation, for example, that it can't try stuff out. And this idea of the new and the old combining and finding a new purpose together at the same time, I think is very exciting.
I think this is a very fascinating approach, as Flora had it, when we see nature as a kind of heritage. If we combine, as you had it, Ian, if we combine in curated spaces, very practical. So there are curators responsible for the respective space as place. And then we can combine this cultural with the natural heritage with mobile approaches to the city, which is a new understanding of architecture at all. So this architectural urban space is not built more or less forever. Parts of it can shift, parts of it remain. And the combination is the interesting thing. This is a very, very interesting approach also in practical terms. And we want to address this in the symposium about the green and natural city. We want to host this year in our foundation's seat.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, all there's left for me to do then is to thank you, Ian. It really has been a very interesting conversation, and I think a lot of fascinating ideas and themes to take from it in terms of how we can shape better places for people, for wildlife, bringing together a community and partners at the same time. There are clearly lots of challenges, but also great opportunities out there for landscape restoration, urban regeneration, placemaking, and lots of other things. I'll put the links to the ARC and Articology websites in the show notes so our listeners can also find out a bit more about the projects and the themes we've discussed today. Thanks very much, Ian.
Many thanks, Ian. Many thanks.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Ulrich. It's been really fascinating. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on your podcast.